This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Today's gathering, the agenda of which is that three very distinguished figures in the realm of politics, public life and education are here on this panel to talk a bit and perhaps to answer some questions about their views on the place of history in school education in England. And I'd like, if I may, to begin by introducing our three guests, although it can, of course, truly be said that they don't need any introduction. Kenneth Baker, an exceptionally distinguished career in government during the years of Thatcher and John Major as Minister for Information Technology, Secretary of State for the Environment, Secretary of State, of course, for Education at the time when the national curriculum was passed, subsequently Chairman of the Conservative Party and Home Secretary, and also, of course, author of a considerable number of extremely good, admirable works of history, in particular cartoon histories of prime ministers and monarchs. Secondly, Gorden Marsden, a historian as an undergraduate, subsequently, as many of you will know, editor for 12 years of History Today, MP for Blackpool since 1997, a junior minister during the Labour years in the Lord Chancellor's Department, DCMS, and the Department of Communities and Local Government, and now Shadow Minister for Further Education, Skills and Regional Growth, as well as being a trustee of the History of Parliament. And finally, on my left, Shirley Williams, of course, a major figure in the Wilson and Callaghan governments and Secretary of State for Education during the late 1970s, subsequently a hugely important figure in the founding of the Liberal Democratic Party, which for a time she was leader in the House of Lords, and before, during and between that, a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Between the three of them, they bring to bear a huge array of experience and expertise, and it's immensely good of them to have given up time to be with us this afternoon. So will you please join with me in welcoming our guests here now. Now, the way in which we're going to proceed, if that's all right, is that each of them, as it were in alphabetical order, that's to say beginning with Ken Baker, then Gorden Marsden, then Shirley Williams, is going to speak for about 10 minutes on whatever subjects they think are of relevance and importance in terms of the subject of today's conference, I would say. So there is some sense of relevance and limitation here. After that, we will open the floor to comments and questions and discussion, and then towards the end of the proceedings, I shall ask each of them to offer some closing remarks. I shall then try to offer some general reflections on the course of today's proceedings, after which we shall make the hazardous and difficult and challenging journey across the corridor to a reception at which the book will be launched. So that, as it were, is how we are going to proceed, if that's all right. So that being said, I'd like, if I may, to ask Ken Baker to begin. Ken.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's delightful to be with so many historians, because history was my first love. Your book is absolutely fascinating. It has one glaring error in it, in that it's that when I was Oxford, I studied law. No, I didn't waste my time at Oxford, I studied history. Under very great historians, K.B. Macfarlane, those who are medievalists will know what a great historian he was, Carl Knight, another great medievalist, and John Stoy, who's still alive at 95, an 18th century historian, and A.J.P. Taylor. And so when it fell to me in the 1980s to shape the national curriculum, I wanted to ensure that history had a very important place in it. It was one of the subjects that I ordained at that time, or through legislation ordained, should be continued up to 16. And shaping the actual curriculum itself was, I knew, going to be difficult. I thought some subjects in national would be simple and easy and not controversial. I thought maths must be simple. But I soon discovered, even in maths, feudal armies walked and marched across the field What should trigonometry be taught before 16 or not? Do you have to learn tables by heart or not? Should you allow calculators? And the venom and feeling was so great that various people resigned. I knew history was going to be difficult, so I appointed a man called Commander Saunders Watson. And I appointed him because he owned a castle. He was not a friend of mine, I didn't know him, but I went to Rockingham Castle and was very impressed with the quality of education that he was providing in the converted stable blocks. And I thought he had the right idea that certainly chimed with my idea of history, and he produced history curriculum. It was delivered to the Prime Minister just after I'd moved on. That was a bit lucky, because he focused very much on understanding rather than knowledge, whereas the Prime Minister was clearly knowledge rather than understanding, and I think she won. But the whole idea of that curriculum was to provide a continuous story, a flow of where we came from. And I believe very strongly that all children in all countries and in all generations need to have an understanding of where they came from. And there are, you know, as historians, you'll know there are hundreds of quotations like that from Cicero onwards. So I think that's a very important thing for young children in our society, to know how the country in which they live has been shaped over the years. And you know, I learned my early history in the days of our island story and our empire story and Scotland story. And the only bits of Scotland story that I married a Scot I still remember are those personal stories of Bar the Door Margaret and things like that. I still remember. These things stick in your mind. And I know it's a bit old-fashioned to say, but certainly young children remember very much stories through association with particular characters, particular events, dramatic events of one sort or another. And so where do we face today? I'm sure that Michael Gove probably told you this morning that as a result of him introducing the EBAC, that the number of young people studying for GCSEs history in 2013 has gone up to 39%, which is an increase of 8%. If we didn't give you those figures, I'm sure he should have given them to you. To give you further evidence of that, why that's happening, some of you may be aware that I'm spending my time now establishing new types of schools, university technical colleges, which are 14 to 18, specializing in technical education. 40% of the time below 16 is spent on technical, usually engineering or building works of one sort or another, and 60% academic. On the academic side, which is interesting for you, we do GCSEs in English, Maths and Science, and also history. History is there, and it's because I feel that in fact these youngsters who are specializing in engineering and science must have a feel of what has happened in those areas in the past and their own interests. And I spoke to the history teacher at Walsall, one of the ones that opened this year. I said, what are you teaching in history? And she said, there's one model we're doing, one part of the curriculum is the history of medicine. Apparently it's a very good course, very popular. And I said, the second, and here I groaned. She said, Nazism, the Holocaust, and Hitler. And I would actually ban that now as part of a series of studies. I think it does absolutely no good for our youngsters to go over that period again. It does no good for understanding of modern Germany for a start. And I think we should be more focusing on what's happening in our country. And the third part of her curriculum was British history from 1945 to today, which is a bit like current affairs, a bit like citizenship. And one of the things I'm going to do for the technical colleges is to commission various courses in the lives of great scientists, inventors, designers, what the wheel has done to the world, what steam has done to the world. And I'm going to make these as visual as I can. I'm going to try and do it with the BBC, because I'm a great believer in making history more visual. There's a wonderful quotation embedded in your book by a lady I'd never heard of, a teacher from Sussex in 1910. I dare say you've never heard of her, Harriet Finlay Johnson. I don't know how you found out about her, but she believed in the dramatic method of pedagogy of history. A child learns and retains what he is learning better by actually seeing and doing things. I believe that very strongly indeed. Very, very strongly indeed, seeing and doing. The colleges that I'm setting up are seeing and doing, and they're proving to be very successful and very popular. In history and seeing and doing, the thing I would, in teacher training colleges, teach all history teachers to do, to to acquire an absolute great facility in editing moving images. Now, I know many teachers do this, but I think that's an absolute historical skill, because there is so much in film and on television that is historical, which can be used and engage the attention of the student. And I would hope that teachers would be able to, as it were, as easy as writing in a notebook, in fact, take bits out of films. If I was doing Henry VIII, for example, I would want to do a collation of the different interpretations of Henry VIII. I'd start with Charles Lawton, then I'd move up through them all. I would show him as a hero. I would show him as what Dickens described him, the biggest blot of blood and grease on the annals of our history. And I would get all the aspects, and people could make up their own minds. I'd also teach them a lot of history, the foundation of the Church of England, the great importance of the Reformation Parliament, and things of that sort. And I think they would remember by seeing it visually. And I think teachers are going to go do that themselves, not call some IT expert in, because the teacher will want to interpose their own comments at each stage. Remember this, or make their own comments, as they would if they were writing their notes in the textbook. So I think that's one of the things that I would now do if I was Education Secretary. I would insist that all teachers of history, I'd go wide in history, I think teachers generally should become really adept, so it's absolutely second nature for you to do that. Now, I do know editing is quite difficult, because I edit old gramophone records for verse and poetry, and I'm used to getting them off vinyl, putting them into CDs and tapes and things of that sort. And I know it's quite tricky, and unless you do it very regularly, you forget to press the wrong button at the right moment, and all of that. I do know it's difficult. So you have to learn it so it becomes second nature. That's one of the changes I would make. What else would I do? I would somehow establish in our country a museum that tells the whole history of our country. Now, I had a go at this. Now, I know that what do my our country? I'll come to that in a moment. But what happens on this island, if you like, and I would include Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I had a go at this in the 1990s. Got very far down the road, because the Millennium Commission were going to be the group that I set up, with very distinguished historians, and all party, Dennis Leary, Roy Jenkins, everybody, £50 million to establish a museum in the Hospital of Badgley Close in Barts. And we got even to the stage of agreeing the curriculum. It was a very, very ambitious project, and it cost much more than 50 million. But it was going to happen, because I wanted every young child in our country to visit that museum twice, in their primary and in their secondary. And I wanted to do that because on a visit to Mexico, I only visited Mexico once in my life, but there is a great museum outside Mexico City, which is an UNESCO center, and I was so impressed with it, because it was full when I was there, very beautifully arranged open-air museum, with hundreds of young Mexicans learning about pre-Columbian history and post-Columbian history. And you could see they were fascinated. We have no museum like that in our country, none whatsoever. I'm amazed that we don't have one just doing the political history of our country. That is a story in itself, and it conditions our life today, every day. You know, the freedoms that we have, the liberties we enjoy, how they were won and gained. It's a wonderful thing. And I wanted to recreate all that. The debates between Pitt and Fox, the debates between Disraeli and Gadsden, the debates between Iron Bevan and Ian MacLeod, the debates between Margaret Thatcher and Neil Kinnock. Make them recreate them, make them interesting and lively. And so I would try to do that again if I was Education Secretary. It would be hard going, but I think that's needed in our country. Because I want everybody to share that experience. And particularly those people who've come to our country recently. The flow of immigrant groups over the centuries being one of the enduring strengths of our country over the centuries. And I think, why do they want to come here? Because it's our history has created a place where they want to live. And so I think they should be aware and engage in their history. So that's what I've been trying to do today. Because I do think that it's very important to give all our young people today, particularly in a society which is partly multicultural, a sense of where they have, what our country has come from, and the enduring strengths that make it such an attractive place.
Ken, thank you very much. In that case, I think Gordon, it's over to you.
Right, well thank you very much, David. Can I first of all start by saying it's an absolute delight to be here this afternoon to receive the authorised version, which has been placed on everybody's seat, and Already, as always, you are making waves with the new book, and that's absolutely great. And it's also a great delight and a great privilege to be on the platform with two people who I admire enormously for their contribution to the field of education and history, and that's obviously Shirley Williams and Ken Baker. And Ken mentioned the Museum for British History, and when I was editor of History Today in the 1990s, I was very pleased and proud to play a part in that campaign. And it's a great shame, as Ken said, that thus far it's not come to fruition. I was struck, Ken, very much by what you were saying about bringing the drama to history and bringing history alive and giving historians all the right technical abilities. A mischievous thought passed through my mind. Of course, I don't know how many people here have seen the famous play Lettuce and Lovage, which is about an over-enthusiastic interpreter of a National Trust property who invents an alternative history for it. And one would obviously have to curb some enthusiasm in that area, but I absolutely agree. The other point, and I suppose it shows that things don't change that much. Before I came here today, I decided it would be useful to go down memory lane, and I dug out a book that was published shortly after I became editor of History Today in the mid-1980s, edited by my predecessor, Gorden. It was called The History Debate, and indeed, for all I know, there may be one or two contributors to it here. Of course, it was produced just at the time when all of the ferment of activity around the national curriculum, which you were intimately involved with, was coming to us. And I was struck, I was going to quote this anyway, but I was struck particularly, if I ought to quote it now, you just having said what you said, by the introduction to the essay that was written by the late Roy Porter, who in himself was an enormous contributor to the popularisation, but not the bastardisation of history. And that is always the balance I think we need to strike. What Roy said in his essay, he said, "For the health of history, it's crucial that historians, no less perhaps than the acting profession, recognise their responsibilities to meeting public needs and equally their duty to cultivate good communication skills. Otherwise, we will be treated with deserved contempt as being guilty of a prissy dereliction of duty." So that very, very much vintage Roy Porter. But what I thought it would be useful and helpful, just for me to say, apart from my own views as to where we should go now, and I should stress, I need to stress, that I speak in a personal capacity today, so I'm not making a Labour Party policy on the hoof. I'm giving my views as someone who's been involved with this process, as you referred to, David, for a good 20 years, and seen many of the twists and turns of it. But I thought it might be useful just for me to outline two periods in the past where I think this has been a particular ferment, and to say why I think both of those points are highly relevant today. The first, obviously, is the debate that swirled around the establishment of the national curriculum in the late 80s and what sort of history you should have in it. And Ken, you exempted yourself, and if you hadn't, I would have exempted you equally from the idea that you ever intended, or indeed for that matter the government at the time, ever intended that it should be entirely a fact-driven curriculum. And I think there was a great deal of barren argument in that period between the value of skills and the value of facts. And the truth is you can't have decent skills unless you've got a factual basis on which to proceed and everything that goes with it. But I only mention that today because it seems to me that although one might have thought that particular dragon had been dispatched some 20 odd years ago, it still twitches and it's still alive and kicking, and sometimes it appears in curious forms, even in long-standing professional historians who ought to know better. But it is, I think, worth making the point that just as you cannot have a decent interpretation of history for whatever purpose you want it to be unless you have a factual base of knowledge and context, so it is equally worth making the point that you can't do skills and empathy and all the other things that we talked about so strongly in the 1990s unless you have that factual base. And that is, I think, in every twist and turn of the debate about the national curriculum, that is something we should keep very much to the fore. And I went back again to a number of the articles I commissioned in History Today in the late 1980s when this was going on, and I was struck by what Sally Purkis wrote at the time. She headed it with that wonderful quote from Khrushchev, Khrushchev's view that was historians are dangerous people, they are capable of upsetting everything. And it seems to me that goes very nicely with the very sardonic one that dates from the period, the Soviet period in Russia, which I can't remember who described to, but it was the rather famous aphorism, the past is always changing, only the future is certain. And of course the past is always changing as part of academic debate, apart from totalitarian changes that might come along the way. But again, I think what Sally said, as I say, nearly a quarter of a century ago now, gosh, is still highly relevant to everything we discussed today. She said the skills of the historian, the evaluation and interpretation of evidence are particularly relevant preparation for adult life in a democracy, where one is required to recognise the shortfalls of propaganda and participate in informed decision making. Now that was said before the web, before Wikipedia, before Twitter, before any of the things that today make that comment even more relevant. It seems to me that the whole virtual world, the online world, is the 21st century's equivalent of the fruit in the Garden of Eden, and of course is potentially usable for great good, as we've seen with the changes, the Arab Spring and everything else, as well as potentially great distortion. So I think some of these arguments which were made at that period are still highly relevant. Now I want to deal briefly with the period which I was particularly involved with debate about history from a sort of policymaker point of view, which was really between about 2004 and 2009, when I was asked, initially by Charles Clarke, but subsequently by Andrew Adonis and a number of other ministers subsequent to that, to chair an informal advisory history group to the department. And I think, Charles got a lot of flack, some of you may remember, for supposedly having said things about medieval history. He always insisted to me, and indeed to other people, that he'd been, as politicians so often are, misquoted. And actually what he was going on about was not the uselessness of medieval history, but the uselessness of looking at history from a purely sort of enclosed medieval perspective. I didn't think that entirely let him off, of course, because some of the best clerics and historians of the Middle Ages were also great public figures, but there we are. But anyway, so I was asked to do this job, and I think very much his view, and the view possibly still of ministers, was that it was very important that they had an outside perspective of historians working in the field, and that outside perspective should be as broad as possible. This is not to denigrate in any sense the work of civil servants within the department, and certainly not to denigrate the work done by Ofsted or HMIs. HMIs in particular have played a very, very important part in contribution to this debate over the last 20 years. But there was a sense, I think, that there needed to be a sense of outside thinking all the time. And so that was what we tried to bring to that debate. And I think particularly with Andrew's education minister, where of course he constantly, as all ministers in my view have to do, however enthusiastic they are, he constantly had to sign the self-denying ordinance and not actually do the sort of, I would like to see X, Y, and Z. And if I have a criticism of Michael Gove, and again I feel sometimes that Michael is a little bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because on good days he comes over as a model of sort of thoughtfulness, plurality, and all the rest of it, and on other days somewhat less so. But what I think the challenge, and it's a great privilege to have a Secretary of State who is so interested in history, genuinely is, I mean that quite sincerely. But of course, as I say, he needs to remember, and all elected politicians need to remember, that there has to be a self-denying ordinance. Otherwise, you end up with a system where I know it's a caricature, but where you're all teaching the same thing, school somewhere, wherever. Or you end up with a situation where the twists and turns of the history curriculum are entirely dependent on the twists and turns of the individual occupying the office of Education Secretary, and that would not be a good thing. So I welcome the fact that this debate has yet again been reopened, but I do hope, and I would caution, that we do not, as a result of that, go back to some version of our own story. And as I say, from time to time, this element of conflict, of Jekyll and Hyde, it seems to me, comes out. What I want to see is what I think remains relevant from the discussions that we had as a group in the 2000s, and indeed I think particularly when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister. Gordon Brown, for all the other comments that might be made about his premiership, had a very strong sense of the urgency of understanding Britain's history. One of the reasons why he took a personal interest in the idea of a museum of British history. It didn't come to fruition for a range of reasons, but nevertheless there was that interest there. And I think that one of the debates that we need to have is how we achieve that sense of the connectedness of British history to the sort of 21st century world we inhabit, the sort of 21st century plural identity, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial Britain we inhabit, without in any way destroying the traditional, and it must always remain as the traditional autonomy of historians and academics. And it seems to me that this is particularly relevant if we're going to have a debate about the curriculum and the place of history, whether it's 16 or anything else. Because one of the things that I felt in the early 2000s, and the select committee I served on did a major inquiry on citizenship education, which I prompted them to do. And one of the things I felt at the time was that this endless fight over getting space in the curriculum for history and all the rest of it was disguising the fact that we actually had a potential means of delivering history very broadly, but nevertheless with a narrative framework, and that was via citizenship, and citizenship that is done potentially by everyone at the secondary level. Now, we produced a select committee report. We talked very strongly about the report that Keith Ayebo produced for the government, where he recommended that actually a historical core over the last 250 years, but pulling back on all sorts of other earlier periods of British history should be included. Not just who do we think we are, but how do we think we got to where we are today. And it still seems to me that that would be a mechanism for making sure, because from my point of view, I want as many people to enjoy history as possible. And of course, you know, there is no doubt about the popularity of history in the public domain and all the rest of it. But I also want history to be a vital building block in understanding how this country has come to be the way it is, where it is in the world, so that we don't have a narrow our island story presentation, and an understanding also of the pluralities of history and the pluralities of interpretation. Because without that, some of the skills that we need to rub along as a 21st century Britain, whether it's in the world or within our own country, I think will be lost. So it's not to me a debate about narrow things, important that they may be, as to whether history in the curriculum stops at 14 or 16, but what sort of history we can teach to as broad a range of people as possible that will have a social utility as well as for all the love of the subject and everything else that I take as a given. And I certainly take that as a given and is an important element in lifelong learning. My own particular responsibilities with further education now make me feel this even more sharply, because although the debate inevitably talks about school and it talks about history to 14 or 16, there is a whole changing world out there of teaching, as Kenneth has illustrated by the things he said about the UTCs. And I just think it is extremely important that whatever we do with history, that we reach the broadest range of people as possible, and that includes people in vocational education across say that I think we have great opportunities to disseminate history more broadly, much more widely than we've ever had before with the internet, with online, and everything goes with it. We have a period where we are open-minded on this, but we also have, I think, a very strong civic imperative with all the complications and tensions of our modern world to deliver a view of British history and Britain in the world as widely and as broadly as possible. And I think it's very important that we do that. We don't get too tied up, although it's always very tempting, into narrower points about where we should stop history in the curriculum.
Gordon, thank you so much. That raises, as of course did Ken's remarks before that, a whole set of issues which I'm sure members of the audience will want to take up with you. But before that, we're hugely looking forward to hearing from Shirley Williams. Shirley.
Thank you very much. I just ended 10 years as being the chairman of judges of the Teaching Awards system, and that gave me, if nothing else had ever done so, but I think other things had done so, a huge respect for the profession of teaching. One of the things that I always found inspiring about Teaching Awards was the extraordinary enthusiasm of so many teachers, both for their subject and for their pupils, and that left me, and still in fact from time to time excites me, with a sense of what a rich profession this is and how great its potential can be. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the ways in which I think that Secretaries of State could build on that and haven't always done so. But before I do so, let me just say three things about my fellow panellists. The first is that I've always vastly enjoyed reading History Today, and I enjoyed it very much in its, from its beginning, because one of the great things about History Today as a magazine was that it had this amazing capacity for discovering how innovative history is. If you read History Today, you suddenly discovered aspects of maybe the fight against slavery, or the American Civil War, or some other aspect of history which you thought you knew and discovered that you had only begun to understand. It had this amazing capacity for turning a searchlight on some of the less known areas of history and creating in it, therefore, an astonishing marriage between innovation and history itself. With regard to Ken, I haven't always agreed with him, but on one thing I wish him the very best, and that is that I think what he's embarking upon in the case of the university technical colleges addresses the great big Achilles heel of the whole of education in this country. When I was the Minister of State to Tony Crosland, we tried to embark upon something a bit like Ken is doing at the university level by creating polytechnics. The purpose of polytechnics being, of course, that they would address both local research needs and also applied research needs. They rapidly turned into a new group of universities. That was never the intention, and in my view it has been a tragedy for British education that that's what happened. Because it left again the Achilles heel out there, undealt with, unregarded, passed by, because all the way through English education, much more than Scottish education, there has been this total failure to recognise that you can have great quality and great excellence in applied knowledge, and I think that that has been one of our great problems and remains one of our great problems, and so I wish him very well. And I hope that the university technical colleges will influence the universities as much as they influence the schools. Finally, I have one little tiny argument to have with David, and I've warned him already, great historian that he is, and that is that I found it rather painful, and I have read a substantial part of his remarkable book, and it's a very, very interesting book. But I was sad to see that among the very large majority of totally second-rate Secretaries of State, and I expected to appear myself, and I was rather shocked to find Tony Crosland in that group, because one of the two things I can say about Tony Crosland, the first is that undoubtedly he had a very great influence on education, as great an influence as any other Secretary of State ever has had. And secondly, that he was somebody who cared profoundly about education. And if anybody read the book that he wrote in the 50s called The Future of Socialism, whether they're socialist or not, they will recognise that there is this intense belief that it's only by bringing about greater equality of opportunity in education that you can actually change society into being one of greater solidarity and one of greater aspiration. And that was something he cared about very much, because he recognised, as Ernest Bevan had recognised years before him, that one of the great weaknesses of England is that it's not a country of aspiration. It's a country which recognises quality, which recognises excellence, but through many, many parts of our society, aspiration is something that belongs to other people. And that's something that education has to address. Now let me commit the sin that Gorden referred to in his own speech, which was to say, you shouldn't go back to saying, if I was Secretary of State, I would. I'm going to do exactly that. What would I do if I was Secretary of State today, all these years later? And there you'll see the relevance to history, because I'm going to be fairly controversial, not partisan, but controversial. I think the first thing I would do would be to directly address and challenge what I can only describe as the depressing, in some ways the deplorable hegemony of the examination system. I think the examination system in England particularly has now become so universal, so constant in every part of schools, directing how teaching happens, directing how the curriculum is dealt with, directing children away from the excitement of imagination and of thinking for oneself, that I actually believe they have become counterproductive. I think I would get rid of AS levels right away. AS levels, in my view, ruin the 1 year for secondary school young people when they could actually let their minds run free, when they could innovate, when they had the time to think, when they had the time to work on aspects of history that really excited them, that set flames in their minds. And now what do? They have to go through yet another damned educational examination. A perfectly pointless one, in my view. Secondly, I would address A-levels. I've never been an enthusiast for A-levels. In fact, I will openly state here, though it never got any publicity, that right back in 1977, when I was Secretary of State, I came out in favour of the International Baccalaureate. Why? For two reasons. The first of those was because holistic. I liked the fact that it addressed so many aspects of knowledge in such an exciting way. And secondly, and here I would completely support what Professor Richard Evans said this morning when I was here for the early part of this very interesting conference, that you cannot live in a multicultural, multiracial society without having some constant contribution from the histories of those other countries of which your country is now part. So, for example, I think that we should have, as part of the history of England, some recognition of the history of India, the history of Africa, the history of China. Now, that sounds mad, I know, there's no time in the curriculum. But I've seen, particularly in some of the most exciting English primary schools, the way in which teachers have used things like Eid as the great Muslim festival, Diwali as the great Hindu festival, as a way of exciting their children in these other cultures and the ways in which they are now part of English culture, which is a very, very big patchwork quilt. I completely agree with what Ken said about the way in which one can enliven the teaching of history by pulling in other media. I think it works both ways. One of the reasons for the obsession of our, sorry to say it, our examining boards with Hitler is because Hitler comes through the film and IT and television media, and they excite children because the children can immediately reflect into a visual image or a oral image of Hitler. But as good history it isn't, because unless you know something about the unification of Germany under Bismarck, something about the First World War and Versailles in particular, and something about the Weimar Republic, Hitler coming out of the blue, so to speak, is going to seem like, indeed, like an exciting introduction of aliens in a television program. It's not really history. History has to show how the past in Germany led to the present in Germany and will partly colour the future of Germany. And again, I agree very strongly with Ken Baker that reading about the Holocaust, dreadful though it is, I'm not saying one shouldn't do it, but in a context in which Germany is treated as a kind of separate country to deal with, leaves no understanding of modern Germany, the most transformed nation in Europe, with our children, and it's vital that they have. I think also that we need to use in primary school one of the things that the BBC has given us, which in my view is a very exciting thing. Some of you will have seen that series, I've only seen part of it, of history, the history of objects as a way of approaching history. I think this is wonderful for primary school, because one of the things it enables teachers to do is, in a sense, to have flashcards which show an object, an artifact, and start asking 7-year-olds where they think it comes from. Where did fireworks come from? Good question for Guy Fawkes then. Not just what was the history of it, who was Guy Fawkes, but who invented fireworks. My goodness, it turned out to be China. What a marvellous thing for youngsters aged 7 or 8 to learn. And you could go on with that marvellous programme, the history of objects, taking children as young as primary school, even early primary school, and I believe tremendously exciting. They could go out and find objects, bring them in, and again ask questions about where they came from. And I very much agree with Kathy, who I was strongly supporting from the audience, with what she said about the capacity of quite young children in primary school to have astonishing levels of curiosity, excitement, and willingness to learn, often much more than the early stages of secondary, in areas of this kind, so they have a foundation which is much wider than kings and queens. Something about secondary, well, I've already been brutal about the subject of examinations. I don't like A-levels, I've said that already, I like IB. But above all, what I would like to see in education, and not least in history, is an increasing taming of the hegemony of the examination system. I think we really need the opportunity. I think it was Mr. I tried to remember a gentleman this morning who talked about the need to have 2 hours a week for 3 years to try to get a true picture of history, continuing picture of history through. And I think that's broadly right. And that's going to fall, I think, in the late years of primary and the early years of secondary, because let's be honest, the 11 to 14 group is the most distracted group of all the pupils that we have. The ones most likely to think about other things while they're ploughing their way through the necessary levels that they're expected to get. But I think older and younger children are both much more capable of sustained and excited study. Finally, 2 more controversial things. First, I'd like to see rather more emphasis on what used to be called, and still is sometimes called, the HMIs. Because one of the great things about HMIs was that they were advisors and not just inspectors. I think Ofsted has become, in many ways, too, how do I put it, too interfering in terms of what it expects teachers to do. The great thing about HMIs, and I think that Ofsted is managing to move gradually in that direction, was that they would sit down and talk about the nature of the content of the subjects one was teaching, in a way I think was much less true of Ofsted in its early years, when it saw itself essentially as a kind of Inspector General. Last of all, going back again to something that Gorden said, and also I think that Kenneth said, I absolutely agree that one of the things one needs to do is to track down, in the case of the history of England, some of the continuing themes about it. And I always remember in the back of my head the wonderful remark of Macaulay that Britain was about broadening down from precedent to precedent. Absolutely right, it's a marvellous remark. And somehow what one has to do is to teach children the difference between evolution and revolution. To get them to ask the question why it is that since 1688 England has been a revolution-free patch, maybe not lasting much longer, but it's still been true up to now. Whereas other countries, most other countries, have gone through major revolutions. And to teach them something at least about the high cost of revolution in terms of human happiness, whether it's Mao or Stalin or Hitler. Concentrating just on Hitler means you forget Mao and Stalin. But this is a constant human theme, not a specifically German theme. It's a frightening constant human theme, and it could happen here. And then on evolution, huge piece of luck for our country, but also 1 or 2 questions about how much evolution can begin to equal stick in the mud if we don't give it some kind of dynamic about where it is to go to. And here again I would applaud the references to freedoms, to freedom of expression, to human rights, which I think may be called that, but which remain as constant themes, rather like the theme in a fine concerto of the English experience. Very last thought of all, don't rule out, I think, the contribution of other subjects to history. I tend to be on the same side as the speakers in today's teachers' panel, or one of them at least, in thinking that other disciplines can contribute to history. And I'll give you only one example. I don't think I ever really had any strong sense of the Middle Ages, although I studied it in a kind of half-hearted way, until I read that wonderful poem by Gorden called The Age of Faith, which begins, "In that ago when being was believing, faith was the sum of many credibles." It brought to me, that poem, more than anything I learned from teachers about history, a sense of what the Middle Ages were all about. The extraordinary power of cathedrals, churches, and of course in the Muslim world, mosques, over the way that history was shaped, which one can easily lose. And that's the point at which I'll stop talking about what I would like to have done, because I shan't be able to do it.
Shirley, thank you very much for those remarks and suggestions, and as I'm sure you've intended, and as I hope will turn out to be the case, provocations, and thank you to everybody else on the panel for their comments. I see there's going to be a need for a corrected second edition of this book of ours, which we hope we will get to a little later on. But let us focus on the more important matters that have been raised here by our three panellists this afternoon. And as I'm sure you've all noticed, a very large number of matters have been raised. Ken Baker has talked about the curriculum, the national curriculum being extended to 16, about the long themes of the history of our country, about the need to study the Nazis less, about the need to represent and excite people about history in a visual way, using the media, and with any luck, using a museum of national history. Gorden Marsden has reminded us that the debate about schools versus knowledge has been going on for a long time, and he is of the view that it's long since past its sell-by date. He's also reminded us of how we are supposed in a multicultural IT world to connect with a past which was, as it were, more different from the present than it's probably ever been. And he's also urged the importance of citizenship, which is not an argument that we heard this morning. In fact, we heard a rather different argument, so we may wish to come back to that. And Shirley Williams has suggested that the tyranny of exams is something that we ought to worry about with reference to history, but also more broadly than that. She too is not especially enamoured of the Nazis, and she has made a whole variety of suggestions about teaching history through objects, the role of HMIs, and history as something where we ponder the differences between revolution and evolution. Well, that's a very brief summary of three very rich contributions from the panel. It's now, as it were, over to you to make comments, to ask questions. We have a microphone which I think will be going round. Would you put your hand up if you have a comment to make or a question to ask? Will you wait till the microphone arrives, and will you tell us who you are before you say anything else? Who would like to start? Gentleman there.
Bernard Barker. I'd like to question the conception of the curriculum that underpins, I think, the contributions of most of the political manoeuvres around the curriculum, which is to assume that we're looking at a corpse of the past that we can pull into shape and chop up into pieces and make our preferences about, a set of options that can reduce all past struggles to a final resolution in our current wonderful state of play. And my suggestion would be to you the difficulty with that is that the struggles and contests and battles and ideological perspectives that strive and contend are still doing so, and that any attempt to package up the curriculum in this optional kind of way reduces the future and limits the present. And as someone who's lived through the political control of schooling in my professional lifetime, why I should have to suffer Conservative and Labour politicians deciding what they personally think possibly would be, well, you're going to do it anyway, approach, not really what I associate with democracy. The attempt to dispense with professional judgment, the control from the centre. I mean, why have we got the examinations dominating the system? Because a Labour government gave that absolutely top priority. We're going to measure everything by the results. And now we've got Michael Gove scrapping the targets and introducing the standards and imposing another set of targets. The politicians can treat the curriculum as an option, the rest of us can't.
Could I ask if any member of the panel would like to comment on that?
I'll make one comment before Ken comes in. Beat me out as well. I got a lot to do with what you're saying, and I should say, as Ken knows too, I favour the core curriculum, but not the national curriculum. That is to say, I favour something like, we can't be very precise, but around about half the timetable being directed to core subjects, simply because we had a very mobile population. And you had to therefore have something which a child could carry with him or her to the next school their parents were going to take them to, or the next area they were going to live in, which would be able to be followed through sequentially for a child who moved around. But many children do nowadays move around. I never wanted more than 50% for the reasons you said. I thought the remaining 50% should be for the teachers in the school to be able to decide for themselves, probably having to win at that point some general approval from the local authority, because it was still a local authority-based system, as you know. It was not a national system. It was very decentralised, and I still think the same way.
Ken?
Firstly, don't believe at all that the problems are resolved. That's the Whig view of history, you know, that everything is perfect and everything is resolved. The very problems today about our struggle on human rights and all the rest of it all go way, 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 way back, long, long back, to Blackstone and others. And so I'm not saying that this is a perfect progress to the sunlit broad uplands where we happen to be. In fact, there are lots of rocks in those uplands which you can stumble over. So I'm not suggesting that for the moment. On the question of politicians and control of the curriculum, honestly, we don't control the curriculum. One of my counterparts when I was Education Secretary was the French Minister of Education, called Monsieur Chevènement. I think he disappeared from politics now. He was really a Jacobin in the old sense of the French revolutionary word. And in terms of one weekend, he said, I'm going to write the curriculum this weekend. Went off to his country house, he wanted a chateau, and they sort of did it. I couldn't do that. I tried to appoint various interests, and range right, left, centre, everywhere they came from, to try and decide what in fact the professionals wanted themselves. And that was in the nature of the national curriculum.
Gordon?
I'm not sure I've got much more to add, except to say that often on these occasions people address an imaginary demon rather than the actual demons who are sitting on the platform, and I felt, Bernard, that you slightly fallen into that trap, because I honestly don't think that any of us either pleaded guilty. I hadn't had the power to direct the curriculum in the way that Ken and Shirley had. I don't think any of us pleaded guilty to having done that or wanted to have it done. And I spent some time saying that I thought that it was the greatest peril that any professional politician could step into. But what I don't think that equips elected representatives from is the understanding that history and the whole range of links that it has with other subjects and with the future of our country is something that can simply be left, you know, to sort of bubble away without some sort of structure and framework. And I think that is the debate and the argument is about the structure and framework. But the idea that, as I say, we should have no control, no framework whatsoever, and have everything done, you know, just allow sort of amorphous teaching process to go on. Apart from anything else, I think that would be a grave disservice to people who live in areas of the country where perhaps the schools are not as good. I think you absolutely have to have some form of, I don't want to call it minimum entitlement, but a minimum set of doing things. So while I understand the frustrations about examinations and over-examinations, and incidentally, I mean, I agree entirely with what Shirley has said there about the overuse of examination. I mean, I taught for nearly 20 years as a part-time course tutor at the Open University. It's always struck me that the Open University got it absolutely right in the sense that it had 50% of its coursework and 50% of its exams. And, you know, the reality of life is that there are lots of things in life where we succeed or fail by working with other people over a project over a long period of time. And there are also things where we succeed and fail when a crisis comes up and we have to make rapid decisions. And it's always seemed to me that given that life is balanced like that maybe there's not a bad argument for saying that curriculums and the way in which we assess young people in schools should also be balanced by that.
Gorden is absolutely right. Pre-national curriculum, schools had good curriculums, mediocre schools had mediocre curriculums, and poor schools had poor curriculums. And there were some schools who actually in history did dinosaurs 3 times because the teachers knew about dinosaurs. And so you had to have a framework. You really had to have a framework. And I think no apology for that whatsoever.
Well, I think they're both right in what they say, but I think there's a central issue which I think we have to address. And that is that the degree of micromanagement of teaching has got out of control. It's extreme. It gets carried off from one government to the other. This isn't a partisan point. To be fair, I think probably Labour was even worse than the Conservatives than that. But we really have to give the professionals some room to use their own discretion and creativity in the way that they teach. And while I accept that there have to be minimum standards, they do. I think we have actually carried the whole business of assessing by results to an extraordinary level. And we all know, if we're honest with ourselves, that we have a very great deal of teaching to test going on, where the excitement of the subject is sacrificed to the need to get the kids through yet another damned exam. And in the end, from the children's point of view, it means that the sheer excitement is winnowed out of education. I think that's something close to a mortal sin.
You may be interested to know that when Rab Butler was getting his education bill through Parliament in 1944, when he got to the Lords, Viscount Bledisloe, previously the Governor-General of New Zealand, and a man of such, how shall I put it, gentle mental processes that even King George V called him Lord Bloodysloe, he proposed that an amendment to the Butler Education Bill, which would have made the teaching of the history of the British Empire compulsory. And the retort of Lord Addison, who was the Minister in the Lords shepherding the bill through, was the purpose of this measure is to reform education, it is not to design a curriculum. And no more was heard of the amendment. Whether that
Butler did say at the same time that all children, a very nice phrase, for some part of their education, all children in the country should go through the common mill of education. And that's really what the heart of the curriculum is really about.
I think we need more questions. In order to stop agreement breaking out among the panelists, at the very least, I'm sure that further disagreement can be. We're all against exams, apparently, and we're all against the Nazis. What other consensus may emerge, we'll see. There's some disagreement. The gentleman over there.
Thank you. I'm Michael Ford, I'm a history teacher. I just want to respond to something from each of the panellists because I'm very interested in what all 3 of you said. Baroness Williams, you mentioned teaching about revolution versus evolution. And just this week with my Year 9 students, I've been teaching about 1832 and 1867, and we've been dealing with that very issue of why was there not a revolution in Britain where there was elsewhere. I actually wrote a thesis on this in 2008, and there are articles in the publication Teaching History which talk about getting students to think about the nature of change. So that is going on. I want to come to Lord Baker's point about using video. So I agree, I think it's a great resource, and that's why history teachers use it. And although teacher training colleges don't exist anymore, the University of Cambridge PGCE course, which I work quite closely with, runs a session on using video and editing software to link it together, and not just getting teachers doing that, but getting students doing it as well. And to come to Gordon Marsden's point about content and skill, knowledge and skill, or however we want to frame that, it is obviously still a live debate, and it's one which history teachers are engaging with a lot, and you'll read a lot of articles in journals like Teaching History and the conferences and elsewhere, where history teachers are thinking about innovative ways of recognising you can't have one or the other, it's got to be a marriage of both. So I guess I'm kind of, as you can probably gather, trying to say that actually these issues which you're raising are live issues which we as professionals are dealing with. And it can be very frustrating for us when we hear politicians and journalists stand up and say these things, and we're here thinking, yes, we know these are problems, that's why we're dealing with them. So as a young professional, I'm asking for some advice. And this is what I'd like to know. I'd like to know, what can we as a profession do to make people such as you, politicians, understand what's going on in the classroom. I'm not saying that we've got all the answers, because we don't, but we're thinking about them, we're thinking about them hard. And coupled with that is the other side of the coin, which is what responsibility do politicians and journalists have to actually go out there, find out what's actually going on in classrooms, and talk about it from an evidence base, and not just from something else.
I will, of course, let the panel, who are all more than capable of speaking for themselves, speak for themselves. But just a brief intervention on my part, if I may. One of the things that we, of course, have tried to do in this book is actually to recover, to the extent that it's possible to do, what it was like to be taught history in the classroom. Because we were very much struck by the fact that there is a huge literature of, as it were, polemic and often informed discussion about teaching history in classrooms, which appears to know very little about what the reality of teaching history in the classrooms ever was. And part of the purpose of this book of ours, to the extent that it's evidentially possible, was to try, among other things, to bring alive and recreate that experience. Anyway, enough of me. In which order do the three of you want to go?
Well,
Shirley.
I listened to Mr. Fordham on the panel this morning with some interest, and he obviously feels very strongly what it is to be a professional historian, and I respect that. He's clearly a professional historian who cares very much about the subject. But I think he's being a bit hard on us, because you would not find anybody who'd been a Minister of State in Education who hasn't spent a very great deal of time in classrooms, sitting there, listening, inviting to come and be part of it. I mentioned that I was chairman for 10 years of teaching awards. That inevitably took me into classroom after classroom up and down the country. I think I could also go on to say that, you know, I expect we're all up here, parents and grandparents. Speaking for myself, all my children and grandchildren are in state schools. So I spent a lot of time in their state schools, learning about their complaints and being got at by their teachers. So I think you're being a bit hard on us. We have a job to do. If we spent our whole time in classrooms, you'd probably say, why aren't you getting on with looking at the subject seriously? We try to do that too. And I think I'd end up by saying, because I did listen to you closely this morning and I thought you were very good, but I also thought with great respect that in a way saying to politicians, don't talk about the things that you think we ought to do. But what are we meant to do? We're here on this platform, we've been invited to speak. If we don't show any interest in what you're doing, you say, hey, why don't you do it? Of course we know that the best of you are looking at things like the use of video and the issues about how you reflect revolution and evolution on more than the basis of one nation state. So give us the credit for, if you like, being behind you, but still vaguely aware of where you're going.
Ken?
Right. She's our shop steward. We do know quite a bit about it. I never told teachers how to teach. I come from a teaching family. My wife was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher, was an immigrant actually from Ireland. And I had several great aunts who were teachers. I had a tremendous respect for the teaching profession. Never would I tell you how to teach. I think it's sensible for the government of the day to establish what should be taught. That's what the curriculum has to do. Then it's up to you. It's up to you how you enthuse your students. And I was so pleased to hear you were doing 1832 and 1867 and 18 today. The great constitutional historian Freeman would be very pleased when he said history is past politics and politics is present history. And you're actually showing that in a vivid way, and it makes it relevant. Why aren't we going to, will the tea people, 10 people rather, not the tea party, the 10 people produce a revolution and this sort of thing? And what's missing? Well, they're revolutionary. Fascinating questions for people today. And thank you for educating me. Before you leave, could you please give me the address of the people in Cambridge who are doing this?
Gordon.
Michael, the questions you pose, absolutely fair questions, and you've heard some stab of reply. Of course, Ken and Shirley are now in the place which proves, according to the canard, that there's life after death. Actually, what it proves to me, and I say this as having been a VPS to the Lord Chancellor at the time, what it proves to me that some of the most thoughtful and innovative and energetic comment on politics today still comes out of the House of Lords and not out of the House of Commons. I think that's very important. But to come to the number of points that you made, what can we do? Well, first of all, and again, I'll say this gently, because colleagues have touched on this already. Politicians, I know it's nice to think of them, but politicians swum into the goldfish bowl from somewhere else at some period in their life. Although, of course, one of the issues today, and I think it's a very serious issue, is how many people who go into Parliament have a pre-life outside of politics. I think that is an issue which has it. But so there's that. So you know, just as I don't have to just be a Briton, I can be a Mancunian born who's a Briton, or I can be a black Londoner who's a Briton. We're all capable of multiple identities, and particularly in the 21st century. So I think it's true of politicians, and hopefully, you know, we display that. All members of Parliament, if only from narrow electoral interest, but not, of course, from narrow electoral interest, because it's an essential part of what we do, go around our schools regularly, talk to not just the sort of like the young Mr. Grace, you know, in Noy being so pat them all on the head and say you're all doing very well. We go round because we're asked to go around. We sit in classes and we see the most imaginative work done. And you're sometimes put absolutely on the spot. And I'll just give you one example. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked to go to one of my special schools in Blackpool. And it's a special school that caters to children with special needs, profound special needs, both physical and mental, between the ages of 7 and 18. And I was asked to go to talk to their school council, to talk with their school council. And it so happened I was going on Friday 11th of November, and they phoned me beforehand, and they said, would you come beforehand, Mr. Marsden, and would you actually do our special 11th November assembly, or start the 2-minute silence? And I said, yes, fine. I went, there was this most I mean, imagine how difficult it is keeping any sort of children over that age range quiet and silent for 2 minutes. But this school was absolutely, you know, they've done everything brilliantly. They've done huge poppies, and they've done sort of things about France and all the rest of it. And then suddenly, when it was finished, the 2-minute silence, the teacher, and I hadn't been told about this, but the teacher turned to me and said, and now Mr. Marsden is going to talk to you about the meaning of Remembrance Day. And I thought, I mean, it was a very moving occasion, and I thought, what the hell can I, in this mixed audience, in the space of 3 or 4 minutes, say that's going to be relevant and not sententious and all the rest of it? And I fell back. Actually, it's instance I fell back. But I said, you know, I did the little discursive thing. Why do we have Remembrance Day? Where does the poppy come from? Etc. Etc. And then I said, well, ultimately, I said, it's about remembering all the sacrifices that have been made for us, but it's also about remembering all the individual pains and tragedies that come out of that. And I said, how many of you got grandparents here? And most people put their hands up. And I said, well, my grandfather, his youngest brother, who my father was named after, was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, age 19. And the story in our family, and this is absolutely true, the story in our family is that when the telegram came to my great-grandmother in her house in Manchester, she sat on the stairs in the hallway for 24 hours and would not be moved. And I said, and that is just a personal reminiscence of how these things, and that's what these sorts of remembrances are all made up of. Now, I don't know, you know, whether that was too sentimental or whatever, but I do know that they all sat there and listened, and people came up and asked me about it afterwards. And I think this is, you know, this is what the best sort of teaching and the best sort of interaction with people should be about. And I don't see why politicians should be any less capable of it, frankly, than teachers.
Well, that's in defence of politicians, as it were. Let us have more questions. I saw lots more hands up. Let's ask the gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. Francis Beckett. I'm a journalist. I write about education. I also write history. I thought it was time somebody said something in defence of the Nazis. It does seem to me, I think that Shirley Williams said she would ban all teaching of the Nazis. I'm sorry if it wasn't you, it was somebody else. And Michael Gove attacked it this morning. There seems to be an utter consensus on the panel.
I would not ban the Nazis, but I would put them in context.
Well, Gordon, as you know, I'm uniquely qualified to defend them. What I think that the discussion indicates is how important it is for politicians to stay out of curriculum matters. And the first few pages of the book we're discussing today is all about, a lot of it is about how dictators change the curriculum. There's material about what Stalin wanted to do to the curriculum, and it seems to me that there's an enormous danger for successive governments to start dictating what should go into the curriculum, or at least suggesting what should go into the curriculum. And Michael Gove was an extreme example of it this morning. I couldn't see why he had to be so sneery about cowboys and Indians. If cowboys and Indians turn children on to a particular period of history, even if it is only American history, well, that's great. And it seems to me that there's no harm at all in that period of history being popular with children. The Nazis the story of the Nazis is one, enormously dramatic, and therefore you can interest children in it. Two, terribly important. I agree with what I think Kenneth Baker said, that the trouble with teaching the Nazis just as a thing is that if you don't understand the Weimar Republic, you can't understand it. The trouble is that that's true of absolutely everything you can ever teach in history. I'm going to cheat, if I may, and make one other point, one completely separate point, and that is that we might all have liked Michael Gove to say this morning that he was going to make history teaching compulsory to the age of 16, but why couldn't he do that? And the reason he couldn't do that, I think, is the increasing atomization of education. Ellen Wilkinson, one of your most distinguished predecessors, said that when she had to accept the 11+ system, which she didn't want to accept, she thought it was a lousy system, and one of the reasons she hated it was that it meant that a large number of children were going to be deprived of history up to a certain point, beyond a certain point, because they were going to be taught technical things to enable them to earn their living in a sort of technical way. And that kind of atomization, that's why she hated the idea that you were going to have different sorts of schools for different sorts of children. Now, throughout the period, ever since 1979, we've been atomizing education more and more with city technology colleges, about which Kenneth Baker is the world expert, and with academies, it's all been, and with specialist schools, it's all been designed, it seems to me, to atomize education more and more, to create different sorts of schools for different sorts of children, and therefore to deprive more and more people, more and more children, of the sort of education that Ellen Wilkinson thought they ought to have. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to answer on atomization because you're simply wrong. And I can argue for hours on this particular matter, and you're fundamentally wrong, and history shows you're wrong. But that's the end of that. What I want to say about the Nazis, because I started with the Nazis. I'll tell you why I don't the Nazis. Because I'll tell you what essentially has dropped out of most teaching in our schools today. The 18th century was dropped out. You could do a rather poor inadequate course on the Industrial Revolution. I have a lecture, a very moving lecture, in which I claim that the period 1780 to 1830 was the greatest period in our history. We changed the world with the Industrial Revolution. They were the foundations of parliamentary democracy through the failure of the Georgian kings. Our greatest painters, our greatest poets, our greatest sailor, our greatest soldier stood up and defeated Napoleon. Do any of you teach this at all? Do any of you teach this at all today?
We do.
Oh, enlightened not down there. It's just gone. And everybody says there's not enough time in the curriculum. If you want more time in the curriculum, do what my University Centre College is doing. We start 8:30 in the morning and go until 5:30 every day, except for Fridays when we stop at 5. If you did that, you'd have all the time in the world to teach exactly what you want to do in history.
Well, with the greatest respect, I work those hours and I don't have enough time still. So, I mean, many of us are working.
Shirley, do you want to comment on anything that's been said recently?
My friend over here, I think perhaps the word atomization is not the one I would use, but I would say that I think we're trying to go back to trying to select among different children And we're trying to, as it were, have selection without having selection. Because selection has become very unpopular with most parents. There is if you like, acceptance of what Ellen Wilkinson said, though she was followed, of course, by many others who said the same thing as she, only said it more recently. I think that's a fair point, because I think the academies are, in the end, socially selective, or likely to be so. But I don't think it's quite the same thing as fragmentation. I think that falls into a rather different category. So I'm with you on not bringing back selection. I actually think comprehensive schools have been a major advantage for the 80% of our children who never got through the 11 plus. People who go often get up and shout at me, but they always forget the 80% that didn't go to grammar school, and they talk entirely about 20% that did. And you can't do that in the modern world where everybody has to have at least advanced technical and IT skills and things of that kind. You just can't do it. So I'm with you on that, but I think that fragmentation is the right way to do it.
I'm about to say I'm not unsympathetic to the view that the 18th century is insufficiently taught. I'm constantly reminded of this over the breakfast table. And many mornings by someone else who has actually written about that. Gorden.
That's very brief. I don't want to get into a sort of minutiae of the changes in the education system over the last 30 years. People have different views on all of that. But I do think that where I absolutely agree with you, Francis, is that, and I say this, I've said this in other contexts to members of the present government, when you're teaching, when you're putting together programs, you should be looking all the time. I mean, nudge theory, as we know in certain political courses, is very favourable at the moment, but it's quite possible to nudge people away from things as well as towards them. And I think that everything that we do should be about nudging young people towards an enthusiasm for history, and that we shouldn't be setting up barriers and cut-offs and things of this nature if we possibly can avoid it. But I'm not just talking about schools or colleges, I'm talking about the resources, the way in which we do that. And I mean, I think here again, and this is where it comes down to pounds and pence, the way in which we are still not using, and Ken and I have talked about this over the years, we are still not using the enormous resources anywhere near as much as we should do of our great museums and of Parliament and all the rest of it, the way in which we're not using local museum, local studies. Look at that wonderful, well, I think it's wonderful anyway, that wonderful series of programs by Michael Ward about the village of Leicestershire, the book that he's produced. I mean, we should be doing more of that, but it takes time and it takes money. And that's one of the things that we should be thinking about, to have that comprehensive approach that you're talking about, as well as arguing about what sort of schools there should be and where the cut-off should be and one or another.
I think as historians, history teachers, you should take enormous pleasure and satisfaction in that history is a very popular subject on television. In some of the programs that one sees, that long-haired Scotsman going through the history of our country, absolutely marvellous, I think. And they're really getting big audiences. You've got a lot of public feeling with you, actually. A lot of public feeling with you, and history in the past is very, very interesting.
Let us have some more questions. Gentleman down there.
John Hamer. It's coming back to the issue of British history and the teaching of British history, and accepting as a given that knowledge of British history is a desirable thing. Is desirable. What else apart from knowledge would the panel hope to achieve by the teaching of British history, and have they got any evidence that they would be likely to succeed?
Who would like to start off answering that?
I'll try.
You have to go.
I'll try. And again, forgive me for retorting to anecdote, but it's the only way I think I can deal with this particular issue. I mentioned earlier that, and yes, I think it is about teaching other things than the history of the period or context or whatever. The only thing I think I can do is to refer to my experiences when I was teaching in the late 1980s as a part-time course tutor for the Open University, and what those of you familiar with the Open University course called the second level course. So it's the students have done all their first year general survey course, and incidentally we've not got on to universities and schools and all the rest of it, but I think one of the great tragedies But anyway, so I was teaching the second level course, and it was the course that Christopher Hill, actually, with his Merrymen, produced at the beginning of the 1980s, and it was about rebellion and revolution in England in the 17th century. The sheer use of those titles shows how contentious it might have been. And the problem for the teacher was that all the course material had been laid down by Christopher, and this is a little unkind, not entirely unkind. It's Christopher and his acolytes in about 1979, 1980. However, at the time I was teaching it, there was a whole revisionist school on the 17th century, people like Nick Tyke and others, who basically said, you know, actually the levels weren't that important, and a lot of people in the 17th century weren't that keen on the Puritans and revolutions, and actually some of the Arminians had some good things going for them. So as you could see, I was in somewhat of a dilemma, and I used to try to teach or to talk about these other things that weren't actually in the course material. And I always remember one occasion, there was one gentleman, I think he was in his early 60s, and he was obviously really, and he was quite exasperated with this. And he said, Mr. Marsden, he said, I'm getting very frustrated. Christopher Hill says all of this stuff in the courseware that you're telling me all of these things. But who are we supposed to believe? He said, what's the truth of this matter? You know, what's the truth of this matter? And I said, well, and this was about 1987, 88, just the time of the poll tax. I said, look, I said, let's suppose that you all, and everybody was sort of going on with it. I said, let's suppose that you're all here, you are all a cross-section of British society, and I bring you back into this room in 20 years' time, and I set you an essay which says, Margaret Thatcher was the most important and progressive transformative force of British society in the 20th century. Discuss. I said, now if you were a good cross-section of British society at that particular time, I would come back with essays, everything that was saying that Margaret Thatcher was sainted heroine and greatest thing since sliced bread and this, that and the other, to other people who will probably come to the conclusion that she's been an absolute monster who has destroyed various aspects of British society and particular parts of the country and all the rest of it, and views in between. I said, however, you will all have sat through the same period of history, you will all have had potential access to the same primary materials, depending on which newspaper you chose to read, but you've all come back with these very different views. Why should you be surprised that historians looking at the 17th century should have this variety of things? This is the nature of history. There are no tablets from Sinai.
You asked a very sly question, because you said, what evidence have we got that history isn't just about 1832 and 1867? So I've been thinking hard what evidence there is. Well, if you go around the history galleries of the V&A, for example, you see nothing about the history of Britain in the V&A. It's all about artifacts and design and cloth and furniture and lighting and everything. It's all of that. It's the social history. And lots of people collect in our society today all sorts of old things, old pots, old bits of furniture, old this and that. I'm not talking about millionaires, I'm talking about ordinary sort of people. I used to collect cigarette cards, and I think I learned more from the back of cigarette cards than I did from most books in my primary school. When people collect these things, you learn all about them. It's not just about politics, and people get interested in things that just happened in the past. Is that evidence? Sort of.
Can we have, I think, one more? John, do you want to?
Can I just ask? What I had in mind actually was the notion that when one teaches British history, or indeed any national history, what you're trying to do is, in part anyway, is perhaps to inculcate certain values, certain attitudes and certain beliefs over and above the knowledge. And so my question really was directed at that.
Well, what are the kinds of... The Nordic Museum in York doesn't do that. For example, you go down that little car and you go right through how they all lived in those days. That's not telling you that they...
No, I know.
Running
Yes, well,
I think you might want to resume this over a drink later. Later is getting closer all the time, which tends to be how life is, I suppose. One more question. Lady at the back.
Hello, I'm the head of history. Obviously, I mentioned this before. I'm from Preston, and I'm the head of history there in the school. And obviously, we're talking about the role of history and what we're trying to get that to do, why it's important in society. And the thing that worries me, and I didn't really realise it until I embarked on the work that I was doing with some of my pupils, was the danger of teaching them the national interpretation of, you know, certain events relating to them. So, for example, I was always taught, and I'm ashamed to say this, but I believed it as well, as did some of these pupils that I teach, that women are the drudgery, you know, in these northern towns, and then they got liberation through the wars, and then they went on and they achieved these excellent rights, and now their generation has thrown it away, and condemnation. And the area where my school is, we've got a pregnancy rate that is above the national average, but perhaps most concerning is that the abortion rates are way, way above the national average. And I was concerned with showing, you know, as somebody, you know, from working class background who, you know, has gone into a profession for teaching, because I want to inspire people to, you know, realise their full potential. I wanted to show, like, how could I use history to make these kids achieve and to get over what appears to be a real issue with self-esteem across the board. And the issue, obviously, that we pursued was with the pregnancy rates in our area. Now, when we started doing an investigation, we did an oral history into our area, so we did a local study, general, what was life like for women, give them better role models, and in the hope that obviously they wouldn't fall pregnant and, you know, these risky behaviours. And I was absolutely stunned with what we found. It shocked me to the core in that I was teaching them an incorrect history. And I wonder how many others have been teaching an incorrect history, certainly in our area, about the heritage that, you know, the line that they come from, because the real danger, and I think why it's so important that we should link history, you know, the education of history, to well-being and what we're trying to achieve in society, and, you know, certainly in line that we're in breach of the UNCRC. We should be using history to help children directly to, you know, find the place in society and correct things that are going wrong. And what I saw, you know, which it really transformed the girls, and luckily CAMS did all the measurements and saw that it actually did work, and these girls, the self-esteem was improved, was that they've been taught a false history, so they had no idea of who they actually were or where they came from. Let's forget the big, you know, the island story or whatever. Actually, on a simple individual, my history, they've been taught a false one, as had I, as had people in my family, and even Arthur was involved, and, you know, we had an argument about it, and, you know, in the end it came around to the way of thinking. But if that's just in my area, where I've been teaching them and I've been taught, and, you know, my mum was taught a false history, you know, we've got a responsibility to do something in our local area to use history education to tackle societal well-being, which is, you know, it should almost be second nature that we're doing it. And it just really, really worried me that had I have not done this, I would have continued teaching a false history to my children.
Thank you. So the issue here is, as it were, local history, false history, true history, and their relation to self-esteem. Anyone want to try that?
I'll try one bit of this. I mean, I think until fairly recently, girls suffered from, particularly from under self-esteem. They still do to some extent. I mean, when I just look at my own life, I do quite a lot of speaking to schools, school assemblies and so on. And it's almost invariably the case, and has been the case from the beginning, that for every 3 boys who ask a question, there's 1 girl. That hasn't changed very much. It's true when I started my political life 40 years ago, it's still 45 years ago, and it's still true today. And that lack of self-esteem, which is, you know, then leads off into trying to develop one's self-esteem from, you know, making up or dressing or knowing the latest pop music and so on, it runs very deep. I think one of the ways to tackle it, not least if you're from Lancashire, is to look at some of those great women locally who, for example, led the support that the mill girls of Lancashire gave to the suffragettes, and indeed suffered alongside very badly. Now, the names of them have been lost quite unfairly. In fact, the whole thing's boiled down to the Pankhurst and nothing much else. But that's something that ought to make girls in their local history recognise that they have got heroines that they may not know about but are there. And I think one of the things I would do would be to get a group of girls to go and study the precise contributions that those girls made now 90 years ago, and to tell the rest of the school about it, and to do what Ken was saying, to go out and find pieces from BBC Archive and pieces from some of the local history newspapers and so on, to show how this happened and how it came about. That's just one way, but that's one way that I think can be quite effective.
Yes, coming back to the points you made, I mean, I think they're all very important points. But I take slight issue with Shirley and Faye. I find as I go around my schools that yes, of course, there are problems with self-esteem with young girls, but there are also major problems with self-esteem with young working class boys. And that is actually one of the key, and it's not just in this country either. If you go to other countries, blue collar in America, where you find that blue collar white boys are sort of being outpaced by other people and all the rest of it. That's a whole different ballgame. But I think I agree absolutely with what Shirley said, that you, and I'm going to use two examples, and they're both telly examples, and I know the series Who Do You Think You Are it's obviously juiced up for television, and I'm sure most people here have seen it, or sorry, I'm sure most people here have seen it or know of it, where the celebrity or the so-called celebrity goes back and traces what's happened in their family and offers some terrible story of hardship and all the rest of it. But underneath all the razzmatazz and the way it's actually made for television, there are some really important truths there that connect people to their past. And absolutely, I agree with what Shirley said, that actually it's also about actually showing young women in that situation that some of the problems that they face today are exactly the same sorts of problems that women faced 50, 100, 150 years ago. Of course, the worlds are totally different, the economic circumstances may be totally different, but there are that, and it is about seeing people to whom you can relate. But I'm slightly nervous about this notion of correct history or incorrect history, because actually what we should be teaching people is that history is a constantly evolving process, and although history can guide you and can give you context and can give you some sense of self-esteem, it's not a crutch. It's not a crutch, whether it's the history of our island story or whether it's the history of the glorious proletariat or whatever. It should unsettle. It should keep people thinking. It's not a solution for people's problems, but it is an aid to finding their way out of them.
That's put very well. Could I say very eloquently, because Gorden was one of the great editors of History Today. It's a marvellous magazine. I still get it every month. I remember my history tutor coming into my classroom with the first edition. I can still see it in my mind's eye. He's had a picture of Stafford on the front of it, saying, look, you must read this. And I've been doing it ever since. You're great. Many thanks for that. You raise a really serious and very fundamental question. But one of the most striking things about the last 50 years of British education is the enormous rise of women's and girls' participation in the process. Now, more girls, or young ladies, we call them now, not girls, are going to apply to universities than men this year and next year. I deal every day now in my colleges with vice chancellors. When I was Secretary of State for Education, there was no vice chancellor who was a woman, unheard of. I now deal with several vice chancellors who are women, and I can tell you they're some of the most vigorous vice chancellors I deal with, and very impressive. I deal with FE colleges daily, and once again, I find again and again the heads of FE colleges are women, very outstanding women, very challenging women, often with very original ideas. And so these sort of role models you've got to bring to the attention of your girls, because they're more than 50% of the human race, after all. They've made tremendous achievements over the last few years.
I think that that's probably a good point at which we should begin to wrap things up. So could I ask Ken and then Gorden and then Shirley if they have some brief final thoughts before we cross the corridor for refreshment.
Well, thank you for all that you do. Because I really do believe history is one of the most important things to embed. I do this for my grandchildren as much as I can. I have one great plan to make your lives even easier. If I was constructing a national curriculum today, I would actually stop it at 14. And from 14, I would have 4 different types of schools. I would have an academic grammar school, I'd have a technical school like I'm doing, I'd have a performing arts, creative arts school, and I would have a career academy school. This is, I would do atomization after that. This chap has left in shame and disgrace. That would be my proposal for the future, and history would play a large part in all of those schools.
I think all I would say is that when I think about the range of materials that was available to me when I was growing up to learn about history, I mean, the richness, potential richness of resources, whether it's on the internet or the other sources that we've talked about today, has never been greater. But the need has never been greater as well for you out there as history professors and teachers to communicate and to overcome. And on another occasion, I would give a diatribe against the research assessment exercise and the way in which it sort of narrows and cribs professional historians and doesn't enable them to make as many of the excellent connections with schools that were done 30 or 40 years ago by some of the great historians of that period. And I think there is a real danger of that. I've been going about this for years. But I think that is what we have to do, and we have to fight our corner for our subject. You know, the idea that the humanities are not an important part of, you can guess, and I have a better fear of Dave Bullets on this issue. The idea that humanities are not an important part of what we should be studying and paying for in our universities, to me, is just a monstrosity. But what is equally important is that we embed the role of history, not just in our schools, but in our civic life. And that, I think, is a challenge for all of us.
Well, I very much agree with that. I would simply say that I agree also with what Gorden said about the absolute tsunami of new resources that are now available, enough to simply batter the mind over the whole range of the different kinds of media and ways of getting across communication. I would only add up one other thing which I think is really difficult, and that is that we're moving, whether we like it or not, into an increasingly interdependent world. One sees the way in which interdependence then is reflected by localism. In some ways, people escape from interdependence, which is inevitable in a globalized world, into localism as a form of security. And so you have both greater interest in things like family history, genealogy, local community history at one end, and at the other, youngsters who will be increasingly asking why they should be travelling the world without knowing very much about where they're going to when they get outside this country. I think it's one of the really difficult things for historians to address. And personally, I'm quite attracted by the concept of the history of civilizations. But leave that on one side, and let me also add my thanks to the great work that you do, but also to say I think history is one of the most exciting areas of exploration knowledge that there is. And in some ways, I have to say, I envy you.
Unsurprisingly, this has been a terrific panel. That's partly because the questions have been very good, but it must be said that the answers have also been very good as well. And I hope that this has seemed, for all of you, as it certainly has for me, a kind of worthwhile conversation to have had, even if it's in this unavoidably slightly artificial setting. It seems to me that one of the themes to draw out of today's conference, and I think there are many, and I hope that this is merely the beginning of things, not the end, is the extent to which conversation between, as it were, history teachers and politicians is in fact extraordinarily fruitful. I think the session with Michael Gode this morning was enormously interesting in all sorts of ways, and I think this session this afternoon has proved to be extraordinarily interesting as well, and I hope that these conversations might be carried on further in the future. I have a variety of words of thanks to say at this point. I have more words of thanks to say across there, but you'll have drunk by then, so that will probably seem easier. But I cannot let the conference end without thanking all the people who have made the arrangements and made it possible, in particular Jenny Keating and Nicola Sheldon, who have kind of made the arrangements for everything, really. I'm enormously grateful to all of the panelists and all the chairs and all the participants. I'm enormously grateful to all of you for having come here. It is a spectacularly distinguished audience, and therefore it's hardly surprising that the level of discussion has been correspondingly high. I'm
course thank, with enormous personal pleasure, Shirley and Ken and Gorden for having come along this afternoon. And I simply wish to reiterate, along with those thanks, the fact that drinks are available opposite this book, notwithstanding the errors that have been so tactfully pointed out on the platform. Flawed though it may be, is available, but it's also available at a reduced price, so that may be some atonement for such flaws as he has. So we will shortly cross the corridor and have a drink, but let me end by